and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. In this episode, I'm joined by Reserve Bank Chief Economist and Director of Economics, Paul Conway. Paul took up his Reserve Bank role earlier this year. One of his previous roles was as Economics and Research Director at the Productivity Commission, and it's productivity that he's here to talk to us about. I know that productivity is an issue very close to Paul's heart. Hi, Paul, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. Appreciate you joining us.
Kia ora, Gareth.
When an economist such as yourself talks about productivity, what do they mean?
Yeah, hey, everybody. There's all sorts of ways to think about productivity. There's sort of a narrow definition of productivity that a lot of economics tends to be focused on. And that's how much value add do we create from an hour of work. And we can measure that relatively easily, and we can compare it across countries and do all sorts of interesting analysis with that type of data. And it's meaningful. There's lots of sort of signal about how well an economy is doing by looking at value add per hour worked. But then there's sort of more elaborate measures of productivity where we add in how much capital an economy uses or a business uses to calculate what we call multi-factor productivity. Then we can sort of take account of different skills that employees have. Essentially it just sort of keeps on going. There's lots of management issues around this. I sort of think about productivity in a very broad sense. And I sort of think of it in terms of how much well-being does an economy generate from its, how hard we all have to work and how sort of hard we lean on the environment, that sort of thing. So depending on what I'm working on, I have a very sort of different version of productivity. But, there's plenty of sort of quotes out there from eminent economists saying that productivity isn't everything, but in the end, it's almost everything. And it's the fundamental aspect of our economic performance that determines how an economy goes in the long run. So yeah, it's absolutely fundamental as a driver of well-being in our economy.
So you've covered it. My next question there a bit, which was I was going to ask, why does productivity matter and why should people care about it? But if it drives well-being and I guess the wealth of an economy, etc., those would be the reasons you would cite?
Oh, absolutely. So, productivity, it's essentially about how good businesses or the economy are at transforming inputs, so labor, capital, energy, into value add. That's all very interesting, but productivity or improving productivity is a means to the end of higher well-being in our economy. And I say well-being because if we're more productive, if we're creating more value add from an hour of work, yes, we can take that as higher incomes, but we could also take it as, well, let's not work as much and keep our incomes the same or some combination of the two. So it's not just about getting richer. It sort of impacts on various aspects of well-being across New Zealanders. So yeah, that's why we care about it, because it's the fundamental driver of well-being in an economy.
So you're at the Reserve Bank these days, Paul. So how relevant is productivity and how important is productivity to the Reserve Bank?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think traditionally economists have tended to think about sort of long-run structural growth in the economy as distinct to cycles or the business cycle around those long-run structural trends. But I would sort of push back on that. And at the moment, for example, the economy, demand is stronger than supply. Sort of demand for goods and services is greater than the ability of our economy to supply those goods and services, which is why we've got a bit of inflation. So the Reserve Bank, we're increasing interest rates to sort of slow down demand and sort of get inflation back down into the band. But we could. An increase in productivity, which increases the productive capacity of our economy, would also be disinflationary. So, and wouldn't require the Reserve Bank to increase interest rates by as much and to slow down demand. So they're definitely linked. I mean, we don't use the idea productivity is about that long run structural trend in the economy. It's not about sort of macroeconomic stabilization, but, in understanding what we need to do with interest rates to bring balance between aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the economy. We need to have a very good understanding of what's happening on the supply side of the economy, and productivity is a really massive part of that. The way I sort of think about it, Gareth, is, monetary policy, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. We really need to have a good, broad understanding of what's happening in the economy. I'm really happy that I can bring a lot of that stuff that I learned from the Productivity Commission into the Economics Department at the Reserve Bank here.
You initially talked a little bit about how productivity can be measured. Just wondering if you could go into that a bit more. And I guess one of the things that interests me is, you talk about value add in an hour's work. Value add can be very different in different industries and different jobs, of course. So I wonder if you can just talk a bit more about how to measure productivity and whether that does vary from industry to industry or job to job.
Oh, absolutely. Like there's a whole, many very clever people have spent careers thinking about how to measure productivity. So it's a rabbit hole that goes very deep. I think, if you think of sort of manufacturing businesses or industries, to some extent it's quite straightforward because you're producing, whatever widgets, and it's sort of how many widgets are we producing per person employed or per hours worked. And it gets a little more difficult when you start to sort of move into the services sector in our economy, and you're producing, well, in my case, research papers or monetary policy decisions. So how do you measure the productivity of that, or public sector productivity? And it's not exactly my sort of specialist area, but we are people have been making really good progress in how we measure productivity across different parts of the economy, so that we get measures that broadly are comparable across different bits of the economy and across different economies internationally. But that's not a great answer, except to say it's really hard. But we're making good progress to the point where we have confidence in those types of comparisons.
International comparisons are often made too between countries. So where does New Zealand rank internationally for productivity these days?
Yeah, I think, we're not a basket case when it comes to productivity. I think if you look across the OECD group of economies, which, how many countries is that these days? Is it 30, 36? We are, we're in that group. So that's sort of the top tier in terms of productivity globally. But certainly within those developed economies, we are at the bottom end. We're sort of down the wrong end of that distribution. I think if you compare productivity in New Zealand to the OECD average, I think New Zealanders work about 10% more hours per person, but we produce about 20% less output than your average OECD economy, which is why average incomes and wealth in New Zealand are both, significantly below the OECD average. So, that's sort of a bit of in New Zealand, we tend to grow our economy by sort of throwing, adding labour into the mix. It's been less about investing in capital and investing in new technologies to lift our productivity performance. So we work hard compared to the rest of the OECD, but it's not clear, in terms of improving productivity. Well, we're less productive.
Has it always been that way, or did New Zealand used to be better in terms of productivity?
Oh, back in the 50s and coming out of that post-war period, like New Zealand, we actually had our average incomes were among the highest in the developed world back then, top three, if not the most highest income economy. But, back then we had a relatively small population. We had a strong comparative advantage in rainfall and grass growth. So we had a really productive agricultural sector, which we still do. But we also had really good access to the UK. So we were sort of the garden for the United Kingdom. And we did very well off the back of that. We did sort of literally live off the sheep's back in those days. And then Britain joined the European Economic Community in the early 70s, and we sort of lost that free market access, and things got a bit tougher for us ever since. And we've sort of, as I said, we're not a basket case, but we've sort of been sliding down the international rankings since then until about the mid-1990s, I think. And then we've sort of been holding our relative position in that OECD distribution. So we're not going, further backwards in a relative sense, but there's not much sign of New Zealand sort of catching up towards those frontier economies, those sort of high productivity economies out there. So no, it hasn't always been this way. I think, for a lot of it, we'll probably get to it, Gareth, but I think, our economic geography is a big part of why our productivity performance hasn't been that great. And I think, once sort of refrigerated containerization became a thing, and we did have really strong market access into the UK, economic geography wasn't such an issue for us because we had preferential access. But since we lost that, those kind of forces of economic geography have sort of become, had more of an impact, been more of a handbrake when it comes to our productivity performance.
One thing that you said when you were at the Productivity Commission, a colleague of mine interviewed you, I think, in about 2018, and a couple of things that came up in that interview were the predominance of small businesses in New Zealand, the significant role of cooperatives, and our immigration settings, and all these factors were not really helping us improve our productivity. Can you just explain a little bit about what you mean there?
Sure. I don't remember that interview, but I can imagine what I was trying to say. Like New Zealand, like first of all, I should say that I am optimistic about New Zealand's productivity performance going forward. Like, I think the fact of us being a small economy that's at the kind of last bus stop on the planet has really held us back in terms of our productivity. So many New Zealand businesses aren't particularly well integrated into global markets. Many of our businesses are focused on small regional markets that tend to be a bit insular. So the size of the market determines the size of the firm. So many of New Zealand businesses are small as a result. And as I was saying earlier, we've tended historically at least to grow this economy by sort of throwing labour at it, adding workers into the mix, and that's in part about migration. So I think, all of those factors have sort of conspired to keep our productivity low historically. And the reason, I started out saying I'm optimistic about productivity is because technology is changing everything. So in the digital realm, geography becomes less of an issue. It becomes less of a handbrake. So it's like technology is sort of eroding those economic forces that have kept productivity growth low in New Zealand for so long. So it's become relatively easier for New Zealand businesses to connect globally. We've also got software as a service, so it's become easier for small New Zealand businesses to sort of make the most of advanced digital analytics and the like. And we're having a think about migration settings at the moment, and there's a real shortage of labour around globally and in New Zealand coming out of the pandemic. So I think businesses are starting to think, well, can I grow by sort of investing in capital and adopting digital technology? So I think our whole mindset around this productivity issue is beginning to change, which is great. And I think that change has been empowered by new technology, digital technology in particular. It's exciting.
It sure is. And we'll come back to that, the technology side, the migration side, and those other issues in a minute. I just wanted to throw a couple more questions at you, I guess, as to perhaps why productivity hasn't been great in New Zealand. But I guess looking more broadly, I'm curious as to whether these factors are impacting, I guess, elsewhere in the so-called developed world. The first one is aging populations. We've heard a lot about those, and especially, Japan's an example that really comes to mind there, but New Zealand as well. and also the growth of the services sector and the decline of goods producing industries in recent decades. To what extent are these reducing productivity growth in countries like New Zealand, or have they reduced productivity growth?
Like demographics has been a huge global influence. Currently at the Reserve Bank, in terms of keeping inflation low up until the pandemic, and it may well be changing that sort of the effect of demographics and aging populations on that inflation process. But in terms of productivity, I'm not like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative event for an economy. I know Japan, there's a lot of fretting going on about having fewer workers per retired person in the economy, and that's definitely a challenge going forward. But you kind of use that as a challenge to say, well, okay, if we haven't got as many people around to do the work, then we do have to invest in capital, and we do have to invest in technology, which would be good for productivity growth. So again, it's not necessarily the fact that aging populations are going to pull down our productivity growth rates. In fact, they could spur or more substantial productivity improvements going forward. That's demographics. Sorry, what was your other one, Gareth? Either?
Yeah, the growth of the services sector.
Oh, yeah,
and
the services sector.
Of the goods producing industries. I mean, this is something that's happened over the last few decades.
Yeah, we did an inquiry into this when I was at the Productivity Commission, and the services sector has grown massively. Internationally, I think in New Zealand, about 80% of people work in the services sector these days. So manufacturing has declined in a relative sense as a share of the economy. It was never that big in New Zealand to start with. And overall, the level of productivity in the services sector isn't that great. But there's really extreme variation in the services sector. So there's some parts of it, like the telecoms and information sort of processing part of the services sector, where the level of productivity is the highest in the economy. And then there's other bits of it, hospitality, where it's kind of low. It's sort of demand has shifted towards services. So it's not like we need to configure our economy so that we're just producing the one thing that has the highest productivity sort of payoff. We need to, the economy needs to sort of respond to demand preferences across New Zealanders. So the challenge is, how do we sort of lift productivity in those parts of the services sector where it is so low? And often we've sort of thought about the services sector as being a bit immune to productivity growth. There was sort of the stuff about, if somebody's having a concert, only so many people can go and watch, sort of thing. But again, technology is really challenging that old idea that services sector can't improve its productivity. We've got streaming of music, for example, so that one concert can sort of have a lot more customers than how many people you can fit in the Opera House back in the day. So yes, I think you're right that this structural change in the economy has been one of the factors, towards services, has been one of the factors that's kept productivity growth a bit contained. But also, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think technology, again, is sort of showing the way how we can create a more productive services sector, like here in Aotearoa and also globally as well.
The other thing I wanted to ask about before we move on to, I guess, ways of improving productivity is productivity intrinsically tied to economic growth and vice versa? I guess, do you have to have improving productivity to grow your economy? Do you have to have economic growth to improve productivity? And we do have a lot of concern about climate change these days, and I guess resources being a bit scarce, especially if you look at energy in Europe at the moment, that type of thing. So is lower productivity something that you get if your economy is just simply weak or not growing very much, if at all?
Like productivity is a really important hallmark. Like a healthy economy is an economy that's delivering good productivity growth. That's clear. It feeds into incomes. There's less deprivation in productive economies, and even productive economies have better environments than unproductive economies. So it's a real hallmark of a healthy economy that's doing its job. The job of the economy is to serve the people, and the way an economy does that is through better productivity. I think the point you raise around the sort of transition to zero carbon global economy is really interesting, and I think you're kind of hinting at this idea of degrowth, that to address climate issues we can't have economies that sort of grow in the same way that they have previously. And I think that's true to the extent that previous growth has been based on fossil fuels. And I think it's a huge challenge to sort of rewire our energy systems towards renewables. But I do sort of push back on the idea of degrowth. Like, I don't think that we need to necessarily sort of go backwards in a growth sense to meet the challenges of climate change. And, when I think about, the sharing economy, so like, just for example, a neighborhood, has one lawnmower, for example, across 25 houses instead of everybody having their own lawnmower. Some people would think of that as being degrowth because we don't need as many lawnmowers anymore. But I actually think about that as a technological improvement, because we've developed this technology that allows neighbours within a community to share a piece of capital. In this case, it's a lawnmower. Or when cars are just sort of driving around picking us up and we don't need sort of one, or two per household. I mean, that would classify as degrowth, but I actually think that's regrowth, because it's using technology in a way that means we're less dependent on resources. So I think economic growth is going to continue to be a thing, and will continue to improve well-being and make us better off. And I think that it'll do that in a way that does address climate change, and it will mean sort of less capital per person. But I don't see that as degrowth. I see that as growing in a better, more sustainable way. And I think just New Zealand, we can really be at the forefront of this kind of stuff. We've got good social connection in our economy. So again, it's another opportunity for us to lead.
So I mentioned that you wrote a really interesting article for us back in 2020, I think when you were at BNZ, a pro-productivity policy agenda for New Zealand, and you had a list of 9 things. And I'll just read them off and we can sort of work our way through some of them. We probably won't get to all of them, but number 1 was do immigration better. Number 2, improve the matching of skills to jobs. Number 3, strengthen the economic returns from science and innovation. Number 4, improve the tax system to encourage productive investment. Number 5, improve the housing market. Number 6, improve the provision and functioning of infrastructure. 7, lift competition, especially in parts of the services sector. 8, encourage collaboration. And I think there you were talking about small firms in particular. And 9, improve public sector productivity. Is there anything, I guess, 2 years on that you would add to that list? You have talked about innovation and technology, but I guess that comes under some of those 9 points already.
Yeah, that's right. Like, coming out of COVID, I really started to see the potential for digital technologies to improve New Zealand's productivity performance. So that's sort of in that list around, innovation and the like, and also skills. The more I sort of think about it, like, to successfully adopt digital technologies, to make the most of the digital opportunity, because it's not easy. It doesn't just sort of happen by osmosis or magic. It requires really strong management capability within a business, and it requires workers, labour, to be digitally, literate, to have good, strong digital skills. So that's sort of, and again, that's in there in terms of improve the ability of the education system to create skills that are in demand in the labour market. So, I wouldn't add anything else in there. I think we're making progress on some of those issues, but I think there's still a long way to go. If we are to create a sort of productive New Zealand economy. I should say, it's not just about regulation. It's not just about government policy. I think there's things that businesses can do as well in terms of adopting new technologies. And I know this is a challenge for many New Zealand businesses that are quite small. I think there's a lot that can be gained from sort of learning from, successful businesses in your industry and sort of collaborating. It's sort of unrealistic for every New Zealand firm to have a sort of R&D lab in the basement. So what can we learn from each other? Is there a role for sort of peak industry bodies to help in that collaboration sort of space? And then, of course, there's things for workers to do in terms of keeping our skills up to date so that we can sort of use digital technologies and keeping them fresh. I really like the sort of idea of lifelong learning. That's quite an agenda. I do think coming out of the pandemic that our sort of mindset is a bit changed. I think if we traditionally coming out of economic crises, there's usually a reform agenda that comes off the back of that. And I think coming out of a pandemic, our minds are more open to sort of thinking about, what economy do we want to sort of build and develop and live in. So I do think it's sort of really fertile ground at the moment for thinking about how to build a productive New Zealand economy. And I think, a lot of those policy prescriptions are just as relevant now as they were back in 2020.
In terms of productivity, and I know you've mentioned there that it's an issue for the private sector as much, if not more, than the public sector. But in terms of our politicians, would you like to perhaps hear them talk about productivity a bit more? And do you think we should, at a national level, set any targets?
I don't know about targets. They can end up being a little bit self-defeating in some ways. I think it's important to say that New Zealand's productivity issue has been around for decades. So it's not about any one political party or any one government. I think it's really challenging. And as I was sort of hinting at earlier, I think it's not just about government. One of the things I was really pleased to get done at BNZ is we were quite instrumental in pulling together this group of New Zealand corporates called the Digital Boost Alliance. And we're sort of just saying, what can we do to encourage digital adoption across New Zealanders? And the idea being that a flourishing New Zealand economy is in everybody's best interests, including the corporates. So it's a matter of sort of how can we collaborate and invest in improving the skills and just encouraging the diffusion of digital technologies across the economy. So I do think we should that the productivity conversation should get a little more prominence. I should say I think the Productivity Commission is doing a great job in this respect. But yeah, absolutely, we should be talking about productivity. In fact, I think that was the title of that article that I wrote for interest.co.nz. Let's talk about productivity. So yeah, that hasn't changed. I still think it's important.
Great. Well, look, Paul, that's probably a good place to wrap it up for today. Really appreciate your time. That's Paul Conway, who's the Reserve Bank Chief Economist and Director of Economics. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.